I am talking to you. When a superior officer addresses you, you respond. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?
You will address me as Colonel, and you will do it in this diner, in front of every one of these people, or I will have you removed. The words cracked across the fluorescent hush of the Blue Pine Diner on Route 9, outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, at 6:47 in the evening, and for a moment, nobody in the room breathed. Behind the counter, a woman in a faded green apron stood, with a coffee pot still tilted in her hand, the last inch of liquid trembling at the lip of the spout. Her name tag read Mara. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and just below the crease of her left wrist, barely visible beneath a thin service watch, was a line of raised scar tissue no one in that diner had ever asked about. She did not flinch. She set the pot down slowly, the way a woman sets down something she has learned, somewhere far from here, never to slam. In the back booth by the kitchen pass, a delivery driver named Curtis Boyd looked up from his phone and went very still. He had grown up on an army post, the son of a supply sergeant who never once raised his voice at home because he'd spent all day being obeyed by men who outranked civilians in every way that mattered to him. Curtis knew the particular register of a man used to being agreed with, and he knew, without being able to say how, that the man shouting at the waitress had picked the wrong woman to shout at. He set his phone face down on the table. He did not look away. A waitress who apologized for things that were not her fault. A woman the Colonel was about to lose everything by underestimating. If you've never heard a story like this before, settle in, because this one is going to sit with you for a while after it ends. And if this is your first time here, consider sticking around and subscribing. This channel tells the true stories of women the world walked past, right up until the moment it couldn't anymore. Now, let's get into it. 3 hours before Colonel Everett Halloway raised his voice inside the Blue Pine Diner, the diner did not slow down for sunrise. It never did. Mara Doyle Ellison had clocked in at 11 the night before to cover a double shift for a coworker whose daughter had a fever, and by the time the sun came up over the tree line off Route 9, she had already refilled 40 pots of coffee, cleared 11 tables of truckers heading south toward Charlotte, and mopped a spill of pancake syrup off the linoleum without being asked twice. She moved through the narrow aisles between booths with an economy of motion that nobody who worked with her had ever quite been able to name. She did not rush. She did not startle. When a plate slipped from a busboy's hand and shattered near the fryer at 5 in the morning, she was already crouched and sweeping the glass into a dustpan before the boy had finished apologizing, her hands steady, her breathing unchanged, her eyes already moving to the next thing that needed doing. She was 34 years old, and there was a particular kind of tiredness in her that had nothing to do with the double shift. It lived somewhere behind her eyes, a tiredness with a longer history than one night of bad sleep could explain. The kind that 36 hours on your feet only uncovers rather than causes. Dried flecks of ketchup and syrup marked the hem of her apron by mid-morning, and there was a soreness in her left knee she had stopped mentioning to anyone years ago, an old injury that flared with weather and long shifts alike, and that she managed the way she managed everything, quietly, without complaint, folded into the rhythm of the work. The owner of the diner, a heavy-set man named Grady Pruitt, liked to joke that Mara moved like she was underwater, unbothered, unhurried, and that it drove the younger waitresses crazy because they could not tell if she cared about anything at all. What Grady did not know, what none of them knew, was that Mara's stillness had been trained into her, drilled into her over 11 years, until it was no longer a choice, but a permanent setting, the way a hand that has held a rifle steady for years does not shake even when it is only holding a coffee pot. The younger servers, girls barely out of high school with quick laughs and quicker tempers, sometimes mistook her calm for coldness. They whispered in the break room that she was standoffish, that she never talked about herself, that you could ask her a direct question about her life, and she would answer it so briefly and so pleasantly that you would walk away without actually learning anything at all. One of them, a 19-year-old named Sadie Kowalczyk, had complained to Grady once that Mara felt like working next to a wall. Polite, solid, and impossible to see through. But on the nights when a table of drunk men got aggressive, or a customer collapsed in a booth clutching his chest, it was Mara they looked for first, without quite knowing why they trusted her more than anyone else on shift. Mara, who somehow already had her hand on the man's wrist, counting his pulse, before the ambulance was even called. Mara, who never seemed surprised by an emergency, only quietly, immediately useful inside of it. What none of the regulars at the Blue Pine Diner knew, what none of the cooks in the back, none of the truckers who tipped her well because she remembered their orders, none of the other waitresses who considered her a pleasant but distant colleague, was that 4 years ago, in the mountains east of Kandahar, Afghanistan, Mara Doyle Ellison had answered to a different name entirely. She had served 11 years in the United States Army, the final 6, inside a classified Joint Special Operations Task Force that did not appear on any recruiting poster and was never mentioned by its real designation outside a small, guarded circle of people who had earned the right to know it. Her official specialty had been combat medic. Her actual function, in the language of the men and women she served beside, had been something closer to the last line of defense. The operator, who went in when a team was already compromised, and somebody needed to keep 3 wounded soldiers breathing under fire while extraction was still 40 minutes out, and getting further away by the second. She had trained for years to move calmly through the worst 5 minutes of another human being's life, to keep her hands from shaking when everything around her was shaking, and that training had not left her when the uniform did. It had simply gone quiet, folded itself into her bones, and waited. On the night of an ambush in a narrow valley, the maps called nothing in particular, when a support column was pinned by a coordinated assault and 2 medics were already down, Mara had crossed 60 meters of open ground under direct fire, twice, to reach the wounded, and had kept a young sergeant alive for 3 hours, with 2 collapsed lungs and a leg wound that should have killed him inside of 20 minutes. She had done it without hesitation, the way she did everything, and the men she pulled out that night started calling her Shadowmere before the sun came up over the ridgeline, a name that stuck to her, the way certain names do, quietly, permanently, spoken like a password among people who had earned the right to use it and never used it carelessly. She did not talk about Shadowmere, not because the memory was too painful to touch, though there were nights it was. Nights she woke at 3 in the morning, with her heart going, and had to remind herself, slowly, of the room she was actually in. She stayed quiet about it, because she had learned, in the 2 years since her discharge, exactly what happened to a room the moment people found out. The questions changed. The way people looked at her changed. Colleagues who had treated her as an equal an hour before would suddenly speak to her more carefully, or less, treating her like glass, or like a weapon, never simply like Mara. She did not want to be listened to differently. She wanted, more than she wanted almost anything else in her life, to be a woman who poured coffee and remembered your order and went home, at the end of her shift, to a small apartment with a dog named Reese, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely her own. She had spent 2 years building that ordinariness the way other people build a house, board by board, and she was not willing to let one uniform or one bad night take it apart. Colonel Everett Halloway had commanded the training battalion at Fort Liberty for 19 years, first as a major overseeing logistics, and for the last 11 as the officer in charge of readiness inspections across 3 regional posts. He was not, by any honest account, a cruel man. He had built his entire career on the conviction that discipline was the only thing standing between order and chaos, that a chain of command, respected without exception, was the difference between soldiers who came home and soldiers who did not. He had watched, early in his career, a poorly disciplined unit fall apart under pressure, in ways that cost lives, and the memory of it had never left him. Everything he had built since was, In his own mind, a wall against that ever happening again. He believed, sincerely and without irony, that the rigid structures he enforced were what protected people. Somewhere across 2 decades of being obeyed without question, though, that belief had calcified into something else. A belief that his own authority was the structure, that any failure to defer to him on sight was itself the chaos he had spent his career guarding against. He no longer noticed the difference between the two. Almost no one around him did either. He came into the Blue Pine Diner that evening, still in uniform, having driven straight from a readiness review at the post, tired and irritated, in the particular way of a man who has spent all day being agreed with, and has come to expect it everywhere he goes. He ordered his coffee black, and complained, not loudly at first, that it had arrived lukewarm. When Mara apologized and offered to bring a fresh pot, he waved her off, with a flick of 2 fingers, the gesture of a man dismissing a private who has spoken out of turn, and told her, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that competence used to mean something in this country. It was a small thing. It usually is, in the beginning. The bell above the diner door rang twice more before the trouble started, and each time a table nearby needed something Mara noticed before they asked for it. A retired trucker in booth 6 had a slight blue tint forming at his lips that the other servers walked past without seeing. Mara did not walk past it. She set down the tray she was carrying, crossed to his table without asking permission from anyone, and asked him quietly whether he had a history of heart trouble, whether he'd taken his nitroglycerin that day. He blinked at her, startled, and admitted he'd forgotten it in his truck. She sent the busboy running for it, stayed crouched at his eye level counting the rhythm of his breathing against her watch, and by the time the color returned to his face, she had already stepped back into the kitchen without a word, before he could thank her properly. Only Curtis Boyd, still sitting in the back booth, saw the whole thing, and saw the particular way she had known, before any monitor could have told her, that something was wrong. Colonel Holloway saw none of it. What he saw, 10 minutes later, was Mara refusing to remove a small pin from her apron strap, a tarnished silver compass rose, no larger than a dime, that she wore every shift and had for 2 years. After he told her, with the flat certainty of a man used to giving orders that ended arguments, that it was inappropriate for a waitress to wear military-adjacent jewelry in his presence, that it disrespected men who had actually served. "I'd prefer to keep it on," Mara said. "That wasn't a request," Holloway said. "Take it off, or I'll have a word with your manager about who he's employing." "Sir, with respect, I don't think you understand what you're asking." "I understand exactly what I'm asking. I've spent 19 years around real soldiers, and I know a costume when I see one." His voice climbed, drawing eyes from every booth in the diner. "You people think wearing something like that makes you part of something. It doesn't. It's disrespectful, and frankly, it's pathetic." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Pathetic. He had chosen it carefully, the way a man chooses a word meant to leave a mark. Mara did not raise her voice. She set the coffee pot down on the counter, and something in the room shifted the instant she did, though no one could have said exactly what. "I understand you're upset, sir," she said, in the same even tone she had used with the trucker in booth 6, the tone of someone delivering a diagnosis to a family that does not want to hear it. "But I'm going to keep the pin on, and I'd like you to lower your voice. There are other customers here. You will address me as Colonel," Holloway snapped, his face reddening, "and you will do it in this diner, in front of every one of these people, or I will have you removed." "That's your right to try," Mara said quietly, "but I'm not taking it off." "Then you're done here. I'll be speaking to your manager, and I'll be making a call to the county about how establishments like this operate." She did not argue further. She did not raise her hands or her voice or her chin in defiance. She simply went still, a stillness the room could feel more than see, the particular stillness of a woman deciding, calmly, that she had already said everything she intended to say. Grady Pruitt came hurrying from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, already halfway into an apology to the colonel, when the diner door swung open hard enough to ring the bell twice. The man who came through it was younger than Holloway, dressed in a plain gray jacket that did nothing to disguise a certain bearing, a certain economy of movement that people who have spent time around military and intelligence circles learn to recognize instantly. He had a government sedan idling outside and a look on his face that suggested he had heard Holloway's voice from the parking lot. His name was Daniel Whitfield Sorensen, a case officer with the Central Intelligence Agency's Special Activities Center, and he had come into the Blue Pine Diner only because he was starving and it was the nearest place open past 7. He was 3 steps inside the door when he saw her face. He stopped breathing. Not figuratively. His chest simply stalled, mid-inhale, and for 3 full seconds he did not move, standing just inside the doorway of a diner in North Carolina, looking at a woman in an apron, as though he had seen a ghost that had once saved his life, because in a sense, he had. He had been the young captain pinned in that valley outside Kandahar 4 years earlier, the one whose lungs had collapsed, the one who had lived because a combat medic crossed 60 meters of gunfire twice to reach him, and would not let him die on that mountain, no matter what it cost her to keep him breathing. "Shadowmere," he said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, but the diner had gone quiet enough that everyone heard it. Holloway turned, confused by the word, by the sudden reverence in a stranger's voice. Daniel crossed the diner floor in 4 long strides and came to a stop in front of Mara, and did something that made every fork in the room go still against every plate. He came to attention and saluted her, in the middle of a diner, in front of God and Colonel Everett Holloway, and every trucker on Route 9. "Sergeant First Class Ellison," he said, "I owe you my life." The room reconfigured itself around those 7 words, the way a held breath finally lets go. Holloway's face, a moment ago flushed with authority, drained to something pale and uncertain. He did not need it explained to him twice. 19 years in that chair had taught him to recognize, immediately and completely, when he had misjudged the rank of the person standing in front of him. He did not say anything. He simply took 1 step back from the counter, the way a man steps back from a fire he has just realized he built too close to the house. Before anyone could speak again, the door burst open a second time, and this arrival brought no quiet reverence with it at all. A young man in his early 20s stumbled through, half carried by a friend, his shirt soaked through at the shoulder with a spreading dark stain, his face gray under the fluorescent lights, in the particular pallor of a body already going into shock. Behind him, tires screeched in the gravel lot, a truck accident on Route 9, a jagged piece of the guardrail driven clean through the meat of his shoulder near the subclavian vessels, and the nearest trauma center was 18 minutes away, by ambulance that had not yet been called. Mara Ellison was already moving before Grady Pruitt finished dialing 911. She had the young man on the floor between 2 booths in under 10 seconds, her hands finding the wound with a precision that had nothing hesitant in it. "Pressure dressing. Now. Whatever's clean. Towels, aprons. I don't care," she said, and Curtis Boyd was already stripping off his own jacket to hand to her before she'd finished the sentence. Her first technical decision came almost immediately. She assessed the wound by feel before she looked at it directly, 2 fingers tracing the edge of the tear in his shoulder, and determined within seconds that the guardrail fragment had missed the subclavian artery itself by less than an inch, but had opened a smaller vessel wide enough to bleed dangerously fast. She packed the wound with a folded dish towel, her palm braced flat against it at a precise angle, designed to compress against bone rather than soft tissue, her eyes tracking the boy's face, his lips, the rate of his breathing, cataloging all of it in the same unhurried, deliberate rhythm she used pouring coffee at 4 in the morning. "Look at me," she told him. "Not at your shoulder. At me. What's your name?" "Ty," he managed. "Tyler. Tyler. You're going to feel like you're floating in a minute, and that's your body being smart, not you dying. Do you understand me? You stay with my voice." The bleeding was fast enough that the towel was already darkening within a minute, and Mara made her second technical decision without looking up. She directed Daniel Sorensen, still standing over her in his gray jacket, to apply firm two-handed pressure exactly where her fingers had been, while she repositioned to elevate the boy's legs above his heart, buying circulation to organs that mattered more right now than a leg going numb. Her third decision came 30 seconds later, when Tyler's breathing turned shallow and fast. She recognized the early edge of hypovolemic shock forming, and called out for anyone with a belt, cinching it above the wound at a careful angle that slowed arterial flow toward the packed dressing, without fully occluding the limb, buying the minutes an ambulance crew would need, without risking the arm itself. Her fourth decision required her to divide her attention in a way most people in that room could not have managed. Tyler's friend, a young man named Marcus Whitlow, had gone white and was starting to hyperventilate against the counter, his breathing turning shallow and fast, in a way that Mara recognized as the early edge of a panic response about to spiral into something that would draw everyone's focus away from the patient who actually needed it. Without breaking her count of Tyler's pulse under her fingers, she said Marcus's name once, firmly, the way she might once have steadied a private under fire, and told him she needed him breathing slow, so Tyler could hear a calm voice, instead of a scared one, and gave him a job. Hold Tyler's free hand, keep talking to him about anything, football scores, the drive over, it didn't matter what. Marcus's breathing steadied within seconds, simply because she had asked something specific of him, instead of leaving him to spiral in the middle of the room, and Tyler's grip tightened around his friend's hand, instead of going slack. Her fifth decision came as the ambulance sirens grew audible outside. Still a minute out, Tyler's pulse under her fingers had gone thin and rapid, a sign his body was compensating for blood loss by constricting vessels everywhere it could, and Mara recognized the narrow window closing before decompensation set in fully. She called for a second layer of dressing without releasing pressure, had Grady bring a clean tablecloth to reinforce the makeshift belt tourniquet at a wider surface area to reduce tissue damage from the narrow strap, and began speaking to Tyler in short, clipped sentences designed to keep him verbal and oriented, asking him his mother's name, what year his truck was, anything that kept his brain working and his blood pressure from cratering into unconsciousness before help arrived. When the paramedics finally came through the door, she gave them a report in the clean, clinical shorthand of someone who had given 100 handoffs exactly like it. Mechanism of injury, approximate blood loss, vitals trend over the last several minutes, interventions already performed, and the lead paramedic, a broad-shouldered man who had seen plenty of civilians attempt first aid, looked at her for a beat too long before simply nodding and taking the handoff without a single follow-up question, the unmistakable respect of one professional recognizing another. Colonel Holloway did not order anyone. He knelt without being asked and held the diner door propped open for the paramedics he could already hear approaching. And when Mara called for a second dressing, it was Holloway who tore a clean apron off the wall hook and pressed it into her hand, standing to the side afterward, useful and silent, no longer the loudest person in the room, and no longer needing to be. By the time paramedics wheeled Tyler out of the Blue Pine Diner, 11 minutes later, his pressure holding, his color returning, Mara Ellison rose from the floor, with blood on her hands and her apron, and said nothing at all. She did not look for approval in the room. She was already reaching for the mop. It was Daniel Sorensen who found her, 20 minutes later, out behind the diner near the dumpsters, washing her hands under a garden hose because the bathroom sink was occupied and she hadn't wanted to wait. He stood a respectful distance away until she looked up. "I've spent 4 years trying to find out what happened to you after your discharge," he said. "Nobody would tell me anything. Classified, they said, or reassigned, or just gone." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small object, worn smooth at the edges, and held it out to her. It was a challenge coin, the kind carried by the men she had served with, stamped with the crest of a unit that officially did not exist. I've carried this since the mountain. I always thought if I found you, I'd give it back. Mara turned the coin over once in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the particular cold of old metal. I don't do that work anymore, she said. I know. I'm not asking you to. He hesitated. I just wanted you to know somebody remembers exactly who you were and what you did, and that it mattered. The woman who did that, Mara said slowly, isn't gone. But she's not who I am now either. I'm not her anymore. I'm just Mara. She held the coin back out to him. Keep it, he said quietly. It was always yours. He did not press her further, though something in his face suggested he wanted to. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he has said what he needed to say, and knows better than to say more, and walked back toward the lights spilling out of the diner's back door. Colonel Holloway found her a few minutes after that, standing alone by the hose, and he did not offer excuses or qualifications the way men used to being in charge often do. He looked instead at his own hands, still faintly marked with the boy's blood from the apron he had pressed into service. I built a career on believing rank tells you who someone is, he said. I think I understood tonight that it never did. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply stood there, a man reckoning quietly with 19 years of a belief that had just come apart in front of him. And Mara did not tell him it was fine, because it hadn't been. She only nodded once, accepting the admission for what it was, and went back inside to finish her shift. She picked her mop back up and returned to the floor she had left half cleaned. She wiped down booth 6, refilled the coffee at the counter, and took an order from a trucker who had no idea that 40 minutes earlier, the woman writing down his eggs and bacon had kept a stranger alive with her bare hands on a diner floor. The world at the Blue Pine Diner kept moving the way it always did, indifferent and continuous, full of people who would never know what had happened that evening, and did not need to. Mara Doyle Ellison had never needed the world to know her name. She only needed to be somewhere she was useful. And on Route 9, in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and fryer oil, she already was. There's something in Mara's story that stays with you long after it ends. And it isn't really about the CIA officer's salute, or the colonel's quiet reckoning, or even the boy's life saved on a linoleum floor. It's about how easily we decide what a person is worth, based on what they happen to be holding when we meet them. A coffee pot, a mop, a name tag that says nothing about the 11 years, and the mountain, and the 60 meters of open ground that came before it. We build our judgments out of uniforms and job titles, and the tone of someone's apology, and we call that judgment instinct, when really, it's just laziness dressed up as certainty. The truth is that competence rarely announces itself. It waits, quietly, in the people we've already decided not to look at too closely. The tired waitress, the quiet nurse, the woman in the break room who never talks about herself. Mara never asked the diner to know what she'd done. She only asked, one apron pin at a time, to be allowed to keep doing it. That's the kind of integrity that doesn't need an audience, and it may be the rarest kind there is. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the strongest one in it. And if you haven't already, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what comes next. These stories exist because you keep showing up for them. Thank you.